If you have the app and you're able to fill out a survey, if you get 6 or more surveys, there's a gift for you at Swag Central. After this, there's lunch. And if you're attending one of the lunch and learns, please go straight there. They do fill up and they're first come, first serve. Also, the keynotes will start at 2 p.m. I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Maddie Hoffman.
By show of hands, how many of you have experienced an internet outage at home? Pretty much everybody. Super annoying, right? 1 minute, you're working on an email. The next minute, your Wi-Fi icon blinks off, and you're faced with a loading screen. This just happened to me about a month ago. I was working from home on a Friday, and my Wi-Fi went out. I could see that the internet service provider had put up a notice that there was maintenance going on. So I worked offline. I used a hotspot from my phone as I needed it. And I waited, and the whole thing was resolved in 4 or 5 hours. At no point was I worried about my own safety or my ability to communicate with my family. It was just inconvenient. Let's see if I can figure out how this clicker works. Now let's compare my experience with that of a 23-year-old woman named Roj, living in Tehran. In September of last year, protests broke out across the country after Mahsa Amini was murdered by Iran's morality police for not wearing her mandatory headscarf in accordance with the law. The government's response to the protests included increasingly stringent internet restrictions. Roj was working for an agency that made ads for brands on Instagram. When Instagram was blocked as part of the crackdown, the agency was out of business. They tried to use VPNs, but often they didn't have access to one that could connect. And with no way to work, they eventually had to lay people off, including Roj. Roj was also attending university at the time. When the protests began, the university shifted classes online. But often the internet connection was so poor that students couldn't participate, and so class was canceled. For Roj, the internet was a source of income, of knowledge, and of hope. And without a way around the government's internet restrictions, she felt disconnected and disempowered. The impact of internet restrictions on someone's life can be much more dire as well. Mohib-Ullah was living in a refugee camp in Bangladesh, documenting human rights abuses by Myanmar against his community of Rohingya Muslims. Internet restrictions in the camp were repeatedly loosened and tightened starting in 2019. Mohib spoke out about the importance of the internet for information and for safety. Refugees needed access to the internet to contact relatives abroad for help, to access health information, especially as the COVID pandemic broke out, to continue their children's education online, and to keep themselves safe by sharing information to avoid traffickers, smugglers, or armed militant groups. Because of his human rights work and his advocacy, Mohib started receiving death threats. And in the fall of 2021, at the age of 46, Mohib-Ullah was assassinated, likely by members of an armed militant group. His supporters told us that they had had warning that he was about to be attacked, which they attempted to send him on WhatsApp, but the message failed to reach him due to internet speed throttling. This is the magnitude of the stakes when we talk about digital authoritarianism. A persecuted man speaking out on behalf of his community, gunned down because of a communications failure. Hello, thanks for joining me today. My name is Maddie Hoffman. I'm a product manager on a Google team called Jigsaw, which builds technology to address online threats to open societies. Today we're talking about the rise of digital authoritarianism, what it is, what Jigsaw's doing about it, and how you can get involved. We'll have time for questions at the end, so please note them down so that you can ask them when we get there. To start, let's take a look at what we mean when we say digital authoritarianism. Digital authoritarianism is the use of digital information technology by authoritarian regimes to surveil, repress, and manipulate domestic and foreign populations. In short, it's authoritarianism applied to the internet. How many people are experiencing this? By show of hands, what percentage of the world's population do you think currently lives in autocracies? I'll give you 3 options. Less than 25%, 25 to 50%, or more than 50%. So let's see some hands. Who thinks less than 25% of the world's population lives in autocracies? Not so much. 25 to 50%. Couple. And more than 50%. You've done your homework. It's way more than 50%. According to Varieties of Democracy, or VDEM, 72% of the world's population lives in autocracies, representing a dramatic shift since even just 10 years ago. We can think of digital authoritarianism as a set of tactics and behaviors. Governments use these behaviors in combination to infringe on the privacy and security of their populations, to silence dissent, and to entrench themselves in power. There's surveillance, identifying and tracking individuals, analyzing their data, invading their privacy. Targeted persecution, retaliating against specific individuals. Social manipulation and disinformation, misleading and manipulating civilians' beliefs. Then there's censorship, restricting access to content and information. And internet shutdowns, restricting networks through bandwidth throttling, or complete shutdowns of the internet. I'll use the terms censorship and internet shutdowns interchangeably since both prevent access to information. The difference is a matter of degree. The pioneer of internet censorship is China. While the world was building the internet infrastructure to be open and free, China was this weird outlier, building the most comprehensive and sophisticated internet censorship infrastructure in the world. All traffic passes through centralized choke points controlled by the state, which enables mass blocking, filtering, and surveillance. The policies and infrastructure instituted by the Chinese government earned the nickname the Great Firewall of China. And in the mid-90s and early 2000s, the global internet community thought China would see the error of their ways and come back to the idea of a free and open internet. But we were wrong. The trend has moved in the other direction, with broad movement, with countries around the world emulating China. Iran and Russia are the biggest players picking up China's tactics. Iran imposed barriers between their local infrastructure and the global internet, resulting in the halal internet, which restricts access to international platforms and redirects people to domestic alternatives. And over the last year, Russia has also hastened their infrastructural isolation, enabling the separation of the RuNet from the global internet. These countries have widely divergent ideologies, but they're united by what Anne Applebaum calls deals, not ideals. Collaborations for mutual power or financial gain, rather than philosophical alignment. As we've seen the percentage of people under authoritarian rule increase so dramatically, restrictions in online freedom have followed. The Freedom on the Net report, put out in 2022 by Freedom House, found that global internet freedom has declined for the 12th consecutive year. And with more and more countries following in China's footsteps, it's leaving more and more people vulnerable to surveillance, to targeting, and to an information ecosystem that only mirrors the views of their government. The threat of digital authoritarian tactics have reached democracies as well. New regulations across Europe threaten to erode the privacy and security of people who live there. Many of these laws claim to address issues like harmful content or child sexual abuse material, but their implications reach much farther. giving the government the ability to monitor communications by breaking end-to-end encryption, or to enable internet shutdowns, to block social media, or punish platforms that don't comply with removal orders. These tactics are no longer the weird outlier that started in China. They are rapidly spreading across the geopolitical landscape and threatening to splinter the once almost global internet. So we've established that digital authoritarianism is a growing threat with clear human impact as countries apply increasingly sophisticated tactics to limit their people's freedom of expression online. So what can we do about it? To answer that question, I want to tell you about my team at Google and how we're contributing innovation and technical expertise to address the ways that the infrastructure of the internet is being shaped and exploited to support the motives of authoritarian regimes. In 2011, the Arab Spring protests had made their way to Egypt, and people there organized with tech tools like Twitter to gather in places like Tahrir Square and protest and eventually overthrow the dictatorship. It was a moment of profound optimism about the power of technology. But a small group of people at Google, including co-founder Sergey Brin and then CEO Eric Schmidt, watched as the Egyptian government ordered the first major blackout of the internet, and saw that the power of the internet would not only be on the side of freedom. The World Wide Web was a misnomer because some governments wouldn't let their people have access. It was in that moment that Google Ideas, which later became Jigsaw, was born. Google's mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And digital authoritarianism, in particular internet censorship, impacts that notion of universal access in two key ways. First, of course, for people experiencing censorship, it restricts their access to information, but also for the rest of the world. It restricts the information emanating from those countries. Fast forward from 12 years ago, Jigsaw focuses on understanding and addressing digital authoritarianism and other threats to open societies by conducting research and building technology to inspire change. We've been at the forefront of challenging issues faced by Google, from toxicity online to state-backed censorship, terrorist recruiting, and the spread of disinformation. There's no other team quite like us. We're not a think tank because we build technology. Our geopolitical lens is unique in big tech. And while we leverage Google resources, we apply them to the internet as a whole, not just to Google. We organize our work into three focus areas: cybersecurity and censorship, misinformation and hate, and violent extremism. Our approach is highly interdisciplinary and grounded in deep ethnographic understanding. We work in close partnership with subject matter experts, civil society organizations, and people with on-the-ground lived experience. I'm going to focus on sharing some examples of our work related to shutdowns and censorship, which is our longest-standing focus area at Jigsaw. But other areas, certainly including misinformation, touch on digital authoritarianism too. Jigsaw is uniquely situated in big tech between technology, civil society, and geopolitics to make meaningful strides against internet freedom and the use of the internet for internet freedom and the use of the internet as a platform for digital authoritarian tactics. As we move into how Jigsaw is addressing digital authoritarianism, I want to point out that none of the examples I'm going to share is a perfect solution. And everything we do is in the context of the broader community of people working to keep the internet open and free for everyone. We've seen that digital authoritarianism in general is a growing threat. As we move into looking more closely at internet shutdowns, let's start by getting a sense of the scale of this specific problem. So I have another quiz for you. How many internet shutdowns do you think there were in 2022? Let's hear some guesses. Feel free to shout them out. 10? 50? 1,000 plus? What's that? Over 1 million internet shutdowns. The whole range here. The answer, there were 187 shutdowns last year. And the number of countries doing them keeps growing. 2022 saw shutdowns in 35 countries, the largest number that the global human rights organization Access Now has ever recorded. With each solution that I'll share, I'll refer back to that high-profile internet shutdown last year, exactly a year ago, to be precise, in Iran, to demonstrate the impact of our work. Remember, sweeping protests broke out across the country when Mahsa Amini was murdered by the morality police in September. In this photo, we see a woman daring to go without her hijab as part of the Women, Life, Freedom movement. As part of the regime's response, they restricted internet access, cutting Iranians off from each other and the wider world. The government leveraged targeted censorship of specific platforms and blanket shutdowns to disrupt organizing and as a psychological weapon against their population, denying them a voice and the support of the international community. So how does Jigsaw support people like those experiencing the restrictions in Iran? We organize our efforts into 3-part framework: mitigate, prevent, expose. Mitigate is about building tools to help people circumvent internet censorship when they experience it. Prevent is about building infrastructure to make the internet inherently censorship resistant for everyone. And expose is measuring and documenting instances of internet censorship and making that data accessible and intuitive. We have numerous examples of Jigsaw's work in all 3 of these areas, but I'll highlight one of each and discuss its impact on the 2022 protests in Iran. Let's start with mitigate. Mitigate is where the bulk of our work lies. Building tools to help people participate in the global internet despite censorship. And Outline is our flagship product in this space. It's a build-your-own VPN tool that empowers people to fight censorship in a decentralized and grassroots way. VPNs can be effective at circumventing censorship because they can tunnel traffic through national firewalls by disguising it as something innocuous. The key insight behind Outline is that smaller, lesser-known VPNs are better conduits to the global internet for 3 key reasons. First, they provide users with more control over their data compared to free VPNs that might sell your data, track you online, or be a backdoor to give access to governments. Second, they're harder to block. Because using Outline requires getting an access key from a service provider, the censor can't just download the app, find the IP address of the server, and block it. And third, Outline lets VPN use scale to meet the demand. Before Outline, there were only 2 or 3 censorship-resistant VPNs. Outline enables 50,000 VPN servers, which is 22 times the number of exit nodes on the Tor network. And anyone can run one, including you. Outline is made up of 3 core components: the manager, the server, and the client. The VPN provider uses the manager to create the server and manage access. And the end user uses the client to connect to the server and tunnel their traffic through the firewall. Because of our work in mitigation, we often find ourselves in the crisis response business. One early indicator of protests or conflict is a spike in demand for our products. In this graph, you can see Outline client installations on Android and can clearly identify key moments, like when VPNs were blocked in Turkmenistan, the start of the civil war in Myanmar, the start of Russia's war in Ukraine, and finally, the Iran protests. Immediately after the protests began, and the regime stepped up their internet censorship, we saw a spike in demand for Outline. By October of last year, the daily active users on Android was 15 times what it had been before the protests. And ultimately, we ended up reaching over 6 million monthly active users. As the regime enhanced their tactics, we released new features to help people stay connected. And now, usage has stabilized at a significantly higher level than before the protests. Going forward, we want to increase the diversity, resilience, and scale of the mitigation ecosystem. And that's why I'm excited to share with you that last week, we announced the beta version of Outline SDK, a library and set of tools to make it easier for developers to reuse our core networking code and circumvention capabilities. Having a common API means that developers can share cross-platform technology and evolve our mitigation approaches together. And the ability to mix and match strategies increases the diversity of the circumvention tools available and makes it harder to identify and catch all of them. The SDK can be used both by circumvention tool developers and also by app developers serving people in censored countries, like exiled media. We're excited for developers to begin using the Outline SDK and integrating Jigsaw's circumvention technology into their apps. And we'll continue adding and announcing new capabilities in the coming months. Now let's move into Prevent. For Prevent, we're talking about developing and implementing standards to make the internet censorship resistant by default. Online censorship happens in 2 steps: detection and disruption. In detection, the censor wants to differentiate between traffic they do want to allow and traffic they don't want to allow. And that relies on privacy vulnerabilities that expose that information. In disruption, the censor wants to interfere with the traffic that they don't want to allow, which relies on security vulnerabilities. By making the internet more private and more secure, we can make it harder for censors to detect and disrupt traffic. One common way that censors can see our activities online is by looking at what websites we visit. Many people don't realize that even secure standards like HTTPS still reveal the name of the website in clear text. This can present a huge risk for people accessing information that the censor dislikes, whether it's health information, financial information, or information related to protected classes like religions or LGBTQ status. So we want to change that by hiding what website you're visiting, both when you request its IP address through encrypted DNS and when you connect to the site through encrypted client hello. At Jigsaw, we've developed standards and implemented changes to render domain-based interference ineffective. We chaired the working group that established the encrypted DNS standard for DNS over HTTPS, and we've partnered with Google Teams to add or upgrade encrypted DNS in Chrome, Android, and Google Public DNS. We also created the HTTPS record standard, which enables encrypted client hello, and added support for it in Google Domains and Cloud. In the case of Iran, our encrypted DNS app, Intra, enabled people to maintain access to YouTube and Twitter because those were blocked by domain. When we implement these standards in Google products, we're not just protecting Google. Android and Chrome are portals to the rest of the internet. When we protect DNS on those platforms, we're protecting all the traffic that goes through those devices and browsers. But these standards are only valuable if they're used broadly. If they're only applied to sites that censors dislike, they can just block the standard. But if they're applied across the entire internet, then they can't block those sites without blocking the entire internet. So if you run a website or an app, consider asking your cloud provider to enable encrypted DNS and encrypted client hello for you. You'll be protecting the privacy and security of your users and help making the entire internet more resistant to censorship. And finally, expose. Expose is about raising public awareness of events and informing our understanding of the tactics at play. States rarely admit to disrupting the internet, and the distributed physical infrastructure of the internet can provide cover for bad actors, making shutdowns notoriously difficult to track. So we've partnered with academics, technologists, and NGOs to document and expose internet censorship and shine a light on the problem. One such partnership is with the Censored Planet project at the University of Michigan. Together, we built an interactive dashboard that makes internet censorship measurement analysis fast and accessible, since you no longer have to download a massive file or write code. The dashboard provides aggregated data for you to explore, covering 200 countries and over 4,000 websites. So you can see the real-world implications of censorship tactics. We also published our methodology in a research paper, particularly the way that we provide more nuance about what happens when you try to access a website, rather than just labeling it as blocked or not. For example, you can see here an image when WhatsApp was blocked in Iran in the fall of 2022. The shift from green bars to orange bars was the initial blocking, and the addition of purple shows a change in strategy, proving that maybe the initial approach was easier to implement on short notice. Over 60 organizations in the internet freedom community have requested this data for their own research and advocacy, and Censored Planet remains crucial in understanding and responding to internet interference. So what's next? What we've learned through our work to mitigate, prevent, and expose censorship is that it's always an evolving game of cat and mouse, with each side iterating and improving to outwit the other. This never-ending game is pushing us to find ways to be better mice, developing infrastructure and processes that allow for rapid development and deployment of new mitigation technologies. Going forward, at Jigsaw, we're going to focus our anti-censorship efforts on 3 key goals. The first is to continue providing VPN providers and content app developers with the technology and capabilities to reach millions of people experiencing censorship around the world by leveraging Outline SDK and other technical innovations. The second is improving our crisis preparedness, that we and the broader internet freedom community are ready to jump into action next time an event like the Iran protests occur. We're keeping a close eye on Russia's attempts to block VPN protocols to make sure that Outline continues to serve people there effectively as the last VPN standing. And finally, we're starting to think about how we can encourage democratic societies to build technology that embeds democratic values, the same way that authoritarians are already building technology that embeds their values. I see Jigsaw's solutions as signs of hope. We've demonstrated their success in countering digital authoritarianism, as evidenced by their impact in Iran during the 2022 protests. And if we all work together, we can build towards a world in which internet outages are occasional, innocuous inconveniences, like the one I experienced, not threats to the safety and freedom of millions of people like Roj in Iran or Mohib in Bangladesh. So, what can you do to help? I'm so glad you asked. The reason I was excited to come speak with you all today is because you have relevant expertise to fight authoritarianism online. Maybe you didn't previously think of yourself as an activist for internet freedom, but you have the skills to join the movement with us. There are numerous ways you can leverage your expertise, both in personal and professional capacities, to mitigate, prevent, and expose internet censorship. Here are some examples. For mitigate, you can set up and run an outline server and share access with people experiencing internet censorship. We also welcome contributions to our open source code. For prevent, you can enable encrypted DNS and encrypted client hello on any apps or websites you run to make the internet more censorship resistant for everyone. But you can also think bigger than that. As you're designing systems and policies to keep your people and organizations safe, build in technology that's resistant to authoritarian tactics in the future, and avoid the temptation to use those tactics yourselves. And for expose, use the data in the Censored Planet dashboard and other measurement tools to build awareness and amplify the voices of people experiencing internet censorship on social media. And I also hope you'll stay in touch with us at Jigsaw. Staying connected to each other and to the work gives us cause to be hopeful in addressing it together. You can visit our website for information about our work, including other focus areas we didn't get to touch on today. You can subscribe to our publication, The Current, where we combine research, data, technology, and culture across the industry to examine the role of tech and individuals in countering challenging threats to open societies. Our 4th issue was all about internet shutdowns, and the forthcoming 6th issue will be about internet fragmentation, including its impact on cybersecurity and censorship. And you can stay in touch with me on email and LinkedIn. I'm always happy to hear new ideas. Thank you so much for joining me today. With the remaining time, I'm very happy to take your questions. Mark has a microphone, and so if you raise your hand, we can make sure that gets over to you, and you can introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We're about a year now into some concentrated and persistent campaigns by the Iranian government to shut down internet access, about a year and a half to Russia doing the same related to the war in Ukraine. I'm curious what changes and evolutions you might have seen in the tactics and strategies used by these governments over the course of that last year and a half. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for asking. I would say there are probably 2 tactics that I'm keeping an eye on right now. One is this tendency to build the infrastructure so that it can be shut off completely from the global internet. So we've seen Iran working on that to have the halal internet redirect to local domestic alternatives, and we've seen Russia announce that they've been doing tests to also separate their infrastructure. So that's one strategy. The other one we've seen is what we call allow list blocking. Often blocking is based on a list of things the censor doesn't want you to have access to. But a technique we saw start in China and then be applied temporarily during the protests in Iran was the opposite, only allowing specific protocols they do want to let through. And that's why for Outline, one of the features we released during the crisis was the ability to disguise traffic as one of the allowed protocols so that we can bypass that and still be able to get traffic through. It doesn't seem like that's currently being used in Iran or China, but it's because we know these governments share techniques or copy each other, it's one that we're keeping an eye on and expect to see again. Thanks for the question.
Thanks for the presentation. It was very insightful. I have a question on accountability of these governments. A lot of these governments obviously are part of the UN or African Union or intergovernmental organizations, and these organizations, including the UN, have texts that are obviously non-binding, but that are very, very clearly criticizing and denunciating internet shutdowns, but doesn't really seem to be working because they keep doing it. So on what level do you think something should be done to stop this. And I'm not just talking about reporters and what you're doing at Jigsaw, but also like maybe on a broader level in terms of like intergovernmental organizations. I know that in Africa, for example, the ECOWAS Court of Justice has done a ruling in one of these shutdowns in Togo. Obviously, it was afterwards, but it's still probably some achievement, some success. But how do you think these could be prevented on a broader level or higher level? And also, who do you think should be doing this? Is it the UN or is it like another organization?
Accountability is a really great question. And what I'd say is, we're really happy to partner with organizations, whether they're coming from a policy perspective or an advocacy perspective. For example, Access Now, that's done a ton of work raising awareness about these issues through their Keep It On campaign. Jigsaw's focused on making sure that the people who are doing that work have the tools to be able to connect while they're experiencing internet censorship, have internet standards that prevent it in the first place, and have the measurement data, really importantly, to make sure that we can back up those cases, whether it's in court or in policy discussions. So wherever the accountability happens, we want to make sure that we are providing the necessary information and tools to make that an effective argument.
So, appreciate the presentation. Any thoughts to when you have to deal with things like lawful intercept within those particular countries, right? So, Iran, right, starting to utilize Pegasus, right? So, how would you still be able to have an ability to either still bypass, governmental network control while still having to deal with Pegasus on a device?
I want to make sure I understand what you mean by lawful intercept.
They stop you at a checkpoint. They manually load Pegasus onto the phone, during interrogation, and then you're set along your way.
I see.
So for them, it's lawful within their country.
Okay, so you're asking about, just to make sure that I understand, like how do we think about mitigating censorship in a context where someone's had Pegasus loaded on their device by the government?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't know that I have a fabulous answer for you. I'd be really interested to look into that with you and think more about what that would look like. We want to make sure that people continue to have access to the internet. I don't know the interaction between Pegasus and a tool like Outline, but I'd be curious to find out. So thanks for raising it.
Thank you again, very insightful. What happens if the government is on the right side and there are folks who are organizing to hurt, let's say, minorities? What happens then? And so government is trying to kind of keep the minorities safe by implementing these censorship and all.
I see. So you're talking about the use of these tactics to protect
people.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. What we're trying to focus on is building tools to help keep the internet open and free. And so our priority is the millions of people around the world who are experiencing that kind of censorship. There may be some cases where the government has legitimate reason to try to stop certain behaviors. But there are probably numerous other approaches that they could take rather than cutting off internet access to the entire country that would be more appropriate to addressing those problems. So even if there is the possibility of people using the internet for harmful things, by and large, that's going to be true for anything on the internet. And so our focus is really protecting the free access for everyone, even if there isn't some unfortunate downside of that access being made available to people who are doing harmful things.
Got it. Thank you.
If I might, I'm just curious, how did you get involved with this? It's such a great, noble effort.
Thank you so much. I personally had been working in educational technology and was grateful to have the opportunity to come join Jigsaw and take my passion for using technology to have social impact at scale and apply it to these kinds of problems. And as I mentioned earlier, Jigsaw got into this because we saw that the ways that the internet could be used, not just for freedom and access to information, but also for harm, and wanted to find ways to get ahead of those problems and build solutions to address them. So I'm grateful to be part of this team. It's been a real pleasure to have the opportunity to do this, especially coming from, a Google context and being able to kind of focus on these issues while at Google. It's a pretty remarkable opportunity. Okay, thank you all again for being here. Really appreciate your time. We have some Jigsaw and Outline stickers on the table out there, and I have cards if anybody wants to stay in touch with me. But it's great to see you all here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Maddie.